The storm before the flight. The private aviation terminal hummed quietly, a polished oasis of wealth and exclusivity. Sunlight streamed through towering glass walls, illuminating the sleek marble floors and leather chairs arranged with meticulous precision. Flight crews moved with rehearsed efficiency, their crisp uniforms unwrinkled, their faces professional and unreadable. The air carried a faint blend of jet fuel and freshly brewed espresso, a reminder that this sanctuary existed only for the fortunate few who could afford it. Amid this quiet opulence, Dr. Alia Morgan stepped inside, her presence commanding attention despite her understated appearance. She wore a tailored black blazer over a white blouse, her pressed trousers accentuating a statuesque form that moved with poise. Her natural curls framed her sharp features, and her almond-shaped eyes carried the intensity of someone who had spent her life fighting to prove she belonged. In one hand, she carried a leather briefcase. The other rested lightly on a smartphone she barely glanced at. Alia wasn't here to impress anyone. She had long since outgrown the need for validation. At the check-in desk, a woman in her late 20s with bright eyes and a practiced smile greeted her. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I assist you today?" Alia nodded in acknowledgement. "Good morning. I'm here for the Morgan flight to Nairobi," she said, her voice calm but commanding. The attendant's smile faltered briefly as her fingers flew across her keyboard. The name was unmistakable. The Morgan Trust, known globally for its philanthropic efforts, bore a legacy stretching across continents. It wasn't just a name. It was a symbol of empowerment. Still, as the attendant's eyes flicked from the screen to Alia, a hint of uncertainty crept into her demeanor. "Of course, Dr. Morgan," she replied, recovering quickly. "Your jet is being prepped. The captain will be here to greet you shortly." "Thank you," Alia said with a small nod, stepping aside to survey the lounge. She didn't have long to wait. From across the terminal, a tall man in a pristine pilot's uniform approached. His steps were precise, his demeanor polished, but his expression told another story. Captain Greg Harris exuded an air of authority, yet there was something else there. An edge, a subtle arrogance that clouded his otherwise professional exterior. When he reached her, Greg extended his hand. "Dr. Morgan, I presume." Alia accepted the handshake, her grip firm and steady. "Yes, you must be Captain Harris." "I am," Greg said, his tone measured but distant. "Your flight is set to depart shortly. I'll oversee the final checks." Alia studied him closely. She had seen that look before, a flash of skepticism, an unspoken question about her place here. Her skin, her gender, and even her understated style were likely under scrutiny. She gave him the benefit of the doubt, but a chill ran down her spine. "Excellent," she replied, her voice even. "I trust everything is in order." Greg hesitated for a beat too long, then glanced at the young woman behind the desk. "It's rare for owners to accompany their aircraft on these trips," he said. His words were neutral, but the undertone was unmistakable. Alia tilted her head slightly. "Rare, perhaps," she said smoothly, "but not impossible." Greg's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, of course not. Just unusual. Most owners have a management team handle these details." Alia's jaw tightened, though she maintained her composure. "I prefer to oversee things personally. Shall we proceed?" Greg shifted on his feet, but nodded. "Yes, of course. I'll return shortly with the pre-flight updates." As he turned to leave, Alia's eyes followed him, her expression unreadable. The exchange, though brief, had ignited a familiar anger within her. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned her presence in spaces like this, and it likely wouldn't be the last. She reminded herself that she wasn't here for Greg Harris's approval. She had bigger goals ahead. Alia moved to the lounge, where a window offered a view of the jet. It was a sleek, cutting-edge aircraft, one she had acquired not for extravagance but efficiency. As the CEO of Equity Works, a global organization dedicated to sustainable development and social justice, Alia traveled extensively. This flight to Nairobi was critical. She would meet with leaders to finalize a project that could transform lives in rural communities across Africa. This jet wasn't just a luxury. It was a tool to amplify her mission. Sitting by the window, Alia retrieved her tablet and began reviewing the details of the meeting. She tried to push aside the earlier interaction, but Greg's words clung to her like a thorn. Her father had often warned her about moments like this. "They'll test you," he'd said, "but you'll stand taller because you've faced worse." Alia didn't need to be reminded of her father's lessons. His wisdom was ingrained in her, a compass guiding her through life's storms. Minutes later, a soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, Dr. Morgan." Alia looked up to see the attendant from earlier, now carrying a tray with a steaming cup of coffee. "I thought you might like this while you wait," the woman said, her tone genuine. "Thank you," Alia replied, accepting the cup. "What's your name?" The attendant blinked, surprised. "It's Mira, Mom." "Mira," Alia repeated with a small smile. "Thank you for your kindness." Mira hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, she added, "I just wanted to say, I admire your work. My family has followed the Morgan Trust's initiatives for years. You're making a real difference." Alia's smile softened. "That means a lot to me, Mira. Thank you." As Mira walked away, Alia allowed herself a moment of pride. She had fought hard to build something that mattered, something her father would be proud of. But the battle was far from over. Outside, the jet gleamed under the sun, a symbol of her perseverance. Yet, as Alia sipped her coffee, she couldn't shake the feeling that this morning's storm was far from over. The silent battle. The quiet hum of the private terminal gave way to the faint roar of engines on the tarmac as the morning stretched on. Dr. Alia Morgan remained in the lounge, her focus unwavering as she tapped through the presentation on her tablet. She could feel the weight of stares around her, subtle, fleeting glances that spoke volumes about assumptions and whispered judgments. None of it was new to her. She had faced down boardrooms filled with skepticism, governments resistant to change, and rivals who underestimated her at every turn. Yet today felt different. The unease lingered like static in the air before a storm. The faint sound of heels clicking against the marble floor drew her attention. Mira, the attendant, approached again, her posture slightly tense. Alia looked up, noting the faint lines of worry etched into the young woman's face. "Dr. Morgan," Mira began, her voice polite but hesitant, "the captain has requested to speak with you before we finalize boarding. He's just outside near the jet." Alia raised an eyebrow, setting her tablet aside. "Did he say why?" "No, ma'am," Mira replied, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "But he insisted." Alia took a deep breath, feeling a familiar irritation rise. She stood, smoothing the front of her blazer. "Thank you, Mira. I'll handle it." Mira nodded, stepping aside as Alia walked past her, her heels clicking against the polished floors. She wasn't in the mood for another passive-aggressive exchange with Captain Harris, but she knew avoiding the confrontation wouldn't resolve it. She had learned long ago that silence often fed prejudice. Outside, the sun cast a harsh glare on the tarmac. Alia spotted Captain Gray Harris near the jet, his stance rigid, arms crossed over his chest. His expression was neutral, but there was a simmering tension beneath it that Alia could see even from a distance. She approached with measured steps, her head held high. "Captain Harris," she greeted, her tone polite but firm. "I understand you wanted to speak with me." Greg turned to face her, his expression tightening. "Dr. Morgan," he said, his voice clipped. "Before we proceed, I need to confirm a few details regarding this flight." Alia folded her arms, fixing him with a steady gaze. "Details that should already be in your records, I assume." Greg's jaw tightened. "Yes, but there are irregularities." "Irregularities," Alia repeated, her tone sharp now. "I'd like you to clarify." Greg hesitated, as though weighing his words. Finally, he said, "It's not often that we see a passenger personally accompany a jet of this caliber. and it's even less common for someone. He trailed off, his eyes flicking over her before quickly looking away. Alia felt the unspoken words hang heavy in the air. Someone like you. She had heard it in various forms throughout her life. From professors who doubted her capabilities, to investors who dismissed her vision, and now from a pilot questioning her ownership of the very jet she stood before. "Captain Harris," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This jet is mine. Its registration, its maintenance, its crew, everything has been arranged under my directive. If there is any genuine issue, I expect you to state it clearly. Otherwise, I suggest we dispense with this charade." Greg stiffened, his face flushing slightly. "It's not a charade, Dr. Morgan. I'm simply doing my job." "Your job," Alia said, her voice steady, "is to ensure this flight is conducted safely and professionally. It is not to question my place here or make assumptions about me." Greg opened his mouth as if to argue but stopped short. Alia's calm yet commanding demeanor left little room for rebuttal. Instead, he shifted his stance, muttering, "I just want to ensure everything is in order." "Everything is in order," Alia replied sharply. "Now, if you're finished, I'd like to board my aircraft." Greg gave a curt nod, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course, I'll see to it that the flight proceeds as planned." Alia didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked toward the jet stairs, her head high and her steps measured. Behind her, Greg watched, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his posture was evident. Inside the jet, the atmosphere was calm, a stark contrast to the confrontation outside. The interior was a masterpiece of modern design. Sleek leather seats, polished wood accents, and state-of-the-art technology created an environment of understated luxury. Alia settled into one of the seats, exhaling slowly as she gathered her thoughts. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her assistant, Nadine. "Nadine, just a reminder. Final presentation edits are uploaded. Everything is good to go for Nairobi. Let me know if there's anything else you need. Safe travels." Alia smiled faintly. Nadine always had a way of grounding her, even during moments like this. She typed a quick response. "Alia. Thank you, Nadine. I'll check in once we land." She set her phone aside and closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of her father, James Morgan, a man whose legacy loomed large in her life. He had built the foundation for the Morgan Trust, but he had always encouraged Alia to carve her own path. "Never let them tell you who you are," he had said countless times. "You show them." His words echoed in her mind as she reflected on the morning's events. She had spent her life proving people wrong, and yet it never seemed to end. Each victory brought new battles, new skeptics, and new obstacles. But if her father had taught her anything, it was that the fight was always worth it. A knock at the cabin door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Marcus, the flight attendant, looking slightly nervous as he entered. "Dr. Morgan," he began, his tone careful. "I just wanted to check if there's anything you need before we take off." Alia smiled, sensing his unease. "Thank you, Marcus. I'm fine for now." He nodded but hesitated, as though debating whether to say more. Finally, he added, "I just want to say, I admire how you handled things earlier. A lot of people wouldn't have had the patience." Alia tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Patience is a necessity, Marcus," she said gently. "But so is standing your ground." Marcus nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "If there's anything I can do to make this flight more comfortable, just let me know." "I appreciate that," Alia said with a small smile. "Thank you." As Marcus left, Alia leaned back in her seat, gazing out the window at the clouds beginning to gather on the horizon. The flight hadn't even begun, but the day already felt like a battle won. A legacy unfolds. The jet ascended smoothly into the cerulean sky, leaving the polished marble and tension of the terminal far below. Inside the aircraft, the hum of the engines provided a rhythmic backdrop, a steady counterpoint to the whirlwind of thoughts in Dr. Aaliyah Morgan's mind. She gazed out the window as the clouds rolled past, her reflection staring back at her, a silent reminder of the journey she had endured to reach this moment. Aaliyah wasn't just a woman of extraordinary means. She was a woman of extraordinary purpose. The Morgan name was renowned globally, but she had built her reputation not by leaning on her father's legacy, but by expanding it. James Morgan had laid the groundwork for a better world, founding the Morgan Trust to combat systemic inequality. However, it was Aaliyah who had transformed it into a powerhouse of global influence, tackling challenges that governments often hesitated to face. This trip to Nairobi was more than a business venture. It was a pivotal moment. She was about to finalize a multi-year project designed to revolutionize agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, using cutting-edge sustainable technologies. If successful, the project would impact millions of lives, ensuring food security for entire regions. Aaliyah's mind cycled through the details: partners, presentations, contingencies, but the shadow of the morning's confrontation lingered at the edges of her focus. As the jet leveled at cruising altitude, Marcus appeared, his demeanor still carrying a trace of nervousness. He carefully placed a tray with water and a small plate of fruit on the table beside her. "Dr. Morgan," he said softly, "if there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Aaliyah smiled at him, her voice warm. "Thank you, Marcus. I appreciate your attentiveness." He hesitated, then added, I just wanted to say again that what you said back at the terminal really stuck with me. You didn't back down, but you didn't lose your composure either. It was inspiring." Aaliyah regarded him for a moment, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "Thank you, Marcus. And for what it's worth, moments like that aren't easy, but they're necessary." Marcus nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I get it. People like Captain Harris, they don't make it easy for people like us." Aaliyah's brow furrowed slightly. "People like us?" He hesitated before responding. "I've seen how he treats certain passengers and crew. If you don't fit his mold, he finds ways to make things harder. I've dealt with it myself, but..." He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. Aaliyah leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Marcus, let me give you a piece of advice my father once gave me. People like Captain Harris thrive on silence. They count on us staying quiet, on us doubting ourselves. But silence doesn't create change. Speaking up does." Marcus nodded, his expression a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I'll remember that. Thank you, Dr. Morgan." As he left the cabin, Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her thoughts drifting to her father once again. James Morgan had been a towering figure in her life, a man whose wisdom and resilience had shaped her into the woman she was today. He had faced his own battles, different but no less challenging, and he had taught her to face hers with dignity and strength. A father's legacy. Aaliyah's father had grown up in a world that didn't expect much from a young black boy from a small southern town. But James Morgan had defied every expectation, earning scholarships to prestigious universities and eventually founding the Morgan Trust. He had been a trailblazer, but his success hadn't come without a cost. He often spoke of the quiet sacrifices: friendships strained, opportunities lost, and the relentless pressure to succeed in a world that scrutinized his every move. When Aaliyah was young, her father had shared his stories with her, not to burden her but to prepare her. He had once told her about a similar moment to the one she had faced that morning. "I remember walking into a meeting," he had said, his voice steady but edged with an old pain. "I was there to pitch an idea that I knew could change lives. But before I could say a word, one of the executives leaned back in his chair, looked me up and down, and said, 'You don't look like someone who belongs here.'" Young Aaliyah had stared at him, wide-eyed. "What did you do, Daddy?" Her father had smiled then, a mix of pride and defiance in his eyes. "I told him he was right. I didn't look like someone who belonged there. I looked like someone who was about to rewrite the rules. And then I did." The memory brought a faint smile to Alia's lips. Her father's lessons were more than words. They were a foundation she stood on every day. And today, she had channeled that same defiance, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of her phone. It was a text from Leonard Hayes, her longtime friend and trusted advisor. "Leonard, just checking in. How's the flight? Do I need to storm in and save the day?" Alia chuckled softly, quickly typing back. "Alia, the flight is smooth. No need for heroics, for now. But stay ready, just in case." Leonard's reply came almost instantly. "Leonard, always. Call me if Harris pulls anything else. We've got your back." Setting the phone down, Alia turned her attention back to the clouds outside. The confrontation with Harris had been unpleasant, but it was a reminder of why her work mattered. The Morgan Trust wasn't just about charity. It was about breaking barriers and creating spaces where everyone, regardless of their background, could thrive. The pilot's dilemma. In the cockpit, Captain Greg Harris was far from calm. His hands gripped the controls tightly, his jaw clenched as he replayed the morning's events. He had faced difficult passengers before, but something about Dr. Morgan unnerved him. She wasn't like the others. Her confidence, her poise, it had exposed something uncomfortable in him, something he didn't want to acknowledge. "She really got to you, huh?" His co-pilot, James Wilkes, said, glancing over at him. Harris scowled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Wilkes raised an eyebrow, but said nothing, his attention returning to the controls. The silence in the cockpit was thick, and Harris felt it pressing on him. "She didn't have to make it personal," Harris muttered after a long pause. Wilkes snorted softly. "Didn't she, though? Or did you?" Harris shot him a glare. "What's that supposed to mean?" Wilkes shrugged. "Just saying. You came at her like she didn't belong. She called you on it. Maybe instead of being mad at her, you should ask yourself why you're so bothered by her in the first place." Harris didn't respond, but Wilkes's words lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Deep down, he knew the truth. He had underestimated her, and now he was paying the price. The weight of assumptions. As the jet cruised above a sea of clouds, Alia reclined in her seat, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The morning's tension had subsided, but it hadn't vanished. It lingered in the edges of her mind, demanding reflection. She wasn't one to let moments like this pass without dissecting them, analyzing the systems, biases, and histories that created them. This wasn't just about Captain Harris' behavior. It was about a deeper issue, one that had shadowed her life since she first dared to step into spaces where people like her were rarely seen. Her tablet rested on the table beside her, displaying the finalized presentation she would give in Nairobi. It detailed years of work, innovative farming techniques, solar-powered irrigation systems, and partnerships that bridged continents. It was a culmination of her team's dedication and vision, and she was proud of what they had accomplished. Yet, it struck her that even with this evidence of success, she had to fight to be taken seriously. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "They'll test you at every turn. Don't let them define you. You set the terms." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Greg Harris sat stiffly in his seat, his hands gripping the controls more tightly than necessary. The hum of the engines was steady, a comforting sound for most pilots, but it did little to calm him. His co-pilot, James Wilkes, stole a glance at him and sighed. "You're still stewing about it, aren't you?" Wilkes said, breaking the silence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Harris replied tersely, his eyes fixed ahead. Wilkes chuckled dryly. "Come on, Greg. We've been flying together long enough for me to know when something's eating at you. And let's not pretend we both didn't see it." Harris turned his head slightly, his jaw tightening. "See what?" "Her," Wilkes said simply. "Dr. Morgan. She didn't just walk in here with an attitude. She walked in like she's used to people questioning her, and she's learned to cut them down before they get too far." Harris didn't respond, but his silence was telling. Wilkes pressed on. "You came at her sideways," he said, his tone neutral but firm. "Admit it. You looked at her and decided she didn't belong. Then she proved you wrong, and now you're mad about it." Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That's not what happened," he muttered. "I was just being cautious." "Cautious," Wilkes repeated, skepticism heavy in his voice. "Cautious would have been double-checking her credentials and moving on. But you didn't. You kept pushing because she didn't fit the image in your head of who should own a jet like this." Harris's lips thinned into a tight line, but Wilkes wasn't done. "You know what your problem is, Greg," Wilkes said, his voice calm but cutting. "You think people like her have to justify their existence to you. But the truth is, you're not the gatekeeper you think you are. You're just another employee, like the rest of us." Harris didn't respond, but the weight of Wilkes's words hung in the air. For the first time, he felt a pang of doubt, a crack in the wall of self-righteousness he had built around himself. Back in the cabin, Alia's phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a message from Mira, the attendant who had assisted her earlier. "Mira, Dr. Morgan, I hope this isn't intrusive, but I just wanted to thank you for what you said earlier. It meant a lot to me. I've worked here for a while, and I've seen how some people treat others who don't fit the mold. Seeing you handle it the way you did was inspiring." Alia smiled faintly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she composed a reply. "Alia, thank you, Mira. I appreciate your words. Moments like this remind me why it's important to stand up, not just for myself, but for those who come after. Stay strong. Your professionalism hasn't gone unnoticed." She set the phone aside, her smile fading as her thoughts returned to the confrontation with Harris. She had faced many like him before, men who mistook their privilege for authority, who couldn't see past their own biases to recognize her for what she was, a force to be reckoned with. And yet, it still stung. Not because she doubted herself, but because she knew her success didn't shield her from prejudice. It only made her more of a target. Unseen threads of history. The Morgan name carried weight, but it hadn't always been that way. Alia's father, James Morgan, had grown up in the segregated South, where opportunities were scarce and expectations were even lower. He had clawed his way out through sheer determination, earning scholarships and building a career that defied every stereotype. By the time Alia was born, he had already founded the Morgan Trust, but he had never let her forget the sacrifices it had taken. "Your success will always be seen as exceptional," he had once told her. "Not because it is, but because they've decided people like us aren't supposed to succeed. Don't let that stop you. Let it fuel you." And it had. Alia had taken those words and built an empire that her father could only have dreamed of. But moments like this reminded her that the fight was far from over. The captain's turning point. In the cockpit, Harris sat silently, replaying Wilkes's words. His co-pilot had always been blunt, but this time, his words had cut deeper than Harris cared to admit. Was he really that predictable? That small-minded? He hated the idea, but he couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, Wilkes was right. He thought back to Dr. Morgan's unwavering gaze, her calm but firm words. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't resorted to anger. She had simply stated the truth, and it had disarmed him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent years priding himself on his professionalism, but now he wondered if it had been a facade all along. As the jet flew steadily toward Nairobi, Harris made a decision, a small one, but significant nonetheless. He would apologize, not because he wanted to save face, but because he realized he owed her that much. And maybe, just maybe, he owed it to himself to start seeing the world, and the people in it, a little differently. Breaking the ceiling. The cabin was serene, the muted hum of the engines a soothing backdrop as Dr. Alia Morgan flipped through her presentation slides. Her focus was unwavering, but a part of her remained attuned to the simmering tension beneath the surface of this journey. Encounters like the one with Captain Harris always left her with a strange mix of emotions, pride for standing her ground, and a quiet sadness that such battles were still necessary. The presentation before her detailed the culmination of years of work. The Sustainable Harvest Initiative aimed to revolutionize farming practices in sub-Saharan Africa. Through solar-powered irrigation systems, soil regeneration techniques, and educational partnerships, the project promised to uplift communities long overlooked by global development efforts. For Aliyah, this wasn't just a professional milestone. It was personal. It was her chance to leave a legacy that extended far beyond the Morgan name. The weight of responsibility. Aliyah leaned back in her seat, her fingers brushing against the leather armrest as her thoughts wandered. She often reflected on the path that had brought her here. Growing up, she had watched her father carry the weight of his ambitions on his shoulders. He had been a pioneer, a trailblazer in spaces that rarely welcomed him. But his success had come with sacrifices, time, health, relationships. He had once told her, "The higher you climb, the lonelier it gets. But you have to keep climbing, because if you don't, no one else will." Those words had stayed with her, guiding her through every challenge. She had climbed higher than even her father could have imagined, but she knew he had been right. The air was thinner at the top, and the burden of paving the way for others often felt heavier than she had anticipated. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her reverie. It was another message from Leonard. "Leonard, just heard from a contact at the aviation company. Looks like your email is already shaking things up. Want me to follow up?" Aliyah smiled faintly. Leonard's tenacity was one of the reasons she trusted him implicitly. "Aliyah, let's give them time to respond. But stay ready. This isn't over yet." A confrontation in the cockpit. In the cockpit, Captain Greg Harris sat rigidly, his hands gripping the controls as if they could anchor his wavering sense of control. His co-pilot, James Wilkes, glanced at him, his expression unreadable. Still thinking about it, Wilkes asked after a long silence. Harris exhaled sharply. "What's there to think about?" Wilkes leaned back in his seat, his tone casual but edged with purpose. "Maybe the fact that you're letting your own biases screw with your professionalism." Harris bristled. "I don't have biases." Wilkes raised an eyebrow. "Sure you don't. Let me guess. You've convinced yourself this is about protocol, right? About protecting the company." "That's exactly what it's about," Harris snapped. Wilkes shook his head, his voice quieter now. "Greg, I've known you for years. You're a good pilot, but you've got a blind spot the size of this jet when it comes to people who don't fit your idea of who should be here. You need to fix that. Not for her, for you." Harris didn't respond, but Wilkes's words gnawed at him. The truth was hard to swallow, but it was there, staring him in the face. An unlikely ally. Back in the cabin, Aliyah was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Marcus, the flight attendant, stepped inside, his demeanor more confident than before. "Dr. Morgan," he began, "I wanted to let you know we're about 2 hours from Nairobi. If there's anything you need before landing, just let me know." "Thank you, Marcus," Aliyah replied with a smile. She paused, then added, "I hope you know how much I appreciate your professionalism today." Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. If I'm honest, I haven't always felt comfortable speaking up in situations like this. But seeing how you handled things earlier, it reminded me that I don't have to stay silent." Aliyah's smile deepened. "Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong, Marcus. You're here because you've earned it. And you have more power than you think." Marcus seemed to stand a little taller at her words. "Thank you, Dr. Morgan. That means a lot." As he left, Aliyah felt a flicker of hope. Change didn't happen all at once. It was a series of small moments, each one building on the last. And perhaps this was one of those moments. Captain Harris' decision. In the cockpit, Harris stared out at the horizon, the endless expanse of sky offering a moment of clarity. He knew he couldn't undo the morning's events, but he could take a step toward making things right. With a heavy sigh, he turned to Wilkes. "Take over for a minute," he said gruffly. Wilkes blinked in surprise but nodded. "You sure?" Harris nodded, standing and exiting the cockpit. He didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he knew he had to say something. An unexpected apology. Aaliyah looked up as the cabin door opened, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw Harris step inside. His demeanor was different, less rigid, more subdued. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Dr. Morgan," he began, his voice measured. "I wanted to apologize for earlier. I was out of line." Aaliyah regarded him silently, her expression unreadable. Harris continued, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again. "I made assumptions I shouldn't have. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." For a long moment, Aaliyah said nothing. Then she nodded, her tone cool but not unkind. "Thank you for saying that, Captain. I hope it's something you reflect on moving forward." Harris nodded, clearly chastened. "I will." As he left, Aaliyah felt a mix of emotions: surprise, satisfaction, and a cautious optimism. The apology didn't erase the morning's events, but it was a step in the right direction. A flight toward change. As the jet began its descent toward Nairobi, Aaliyah's thoughts turned to the work ahead. The confrontation with Harris had been a reminder of the barriers that still existed, but it had also reinforced her resolve. The world wouldn't change overnight, but it would change, and she would be part of that change, brick by brick, battle by battle. The city came into view below, a sprawling mosaic of life and possibility. Aaliyah smiled faintly. Her father had once told her that every challenge was an opportunity in disguise. Today had been no different, and as the jet touched down, she knew she was ready to face whatever came next. A new horizon. The jet touched down smoothly on the runway of Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, the vibrant city of Nairobi sprawling in the distance. The rhythmic hum of the engines began to fade as the aircraft taxied to a private terminal, where a small welcoming party awaited. Dr. Aaliyah Morgan gazed out the window, her reflection staring back at her, calm and composed. She had reached her destination, but the journey, both literal and symbolic, was far from over. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to exhale, to let the tension from the morning's events dissipate. The confrontation with Captain Harris, though resolved, lingered in her thoughts. His apology had been unexpected, and while it didn't erase his actions, it was a small step toward accountability. Aaliyah had learned long ago that change rarely came in sweeping gestures. It was the accumulation of small moments that chipped away at the walls of ignorance and bias. The arrival. As the jet door opened, Marcus appeared, his professional demeanor intact, but his expression lighter than before. "Dr. Morgan, welcome to Nairobi. Your transportation is waiting, and your team has already checked in at the venue." "Thank you, Marcus," Aaliyah said, offering him a warm smile. "And thank you for your kindness and professionalism throughout this journey." It didn't go unnoticed. Marcus hesitated, his cheeks coloring slightly. "It was an honor, ma'am. You reminded me that it's okay to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. I won't forget that." Aaliyah nodded, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "Good. Don't." As she descended the jet's staircase, she was met by a team of local partners and colleagues, their smiles and handshakes a stark contrast to the tension she had faced earlier. The air was warm, tinged with the earthy scent of rain, a reminder of Nairobi's unpredictable weather. Aaliyah felt a renewed sense of purpose as she stepped onto the tarmac. This was what mattered: building bridges, creating change, and making a difference. The meeting that mattered. Later that day, Aaliyah sat at the head of a conference table in a sleek, modern boardroom overlooking Nairobi's bustling streets. The atmosphere buzzed with energy as leaders, investors, and community representatives gathered to discuss the final phases of the Sustainable Harvest Initiative. Aaliyah's presentation was meticulous, every detail honed to perfection. But it wasn't just the data that captivated the room. It was her passion. As she spoke, Aaliyah's voice carried the weight of her convictions, She outlined how the initiative would empower local farmers, providing them with access to cutting-edge technology and resources. She shared stories of communities already benefiting from pilot programs, their lives transformed by the work her team had done. "This isn't charity," Alia said, her tone firm but hopeful. "This is about partnership. It's about investing in people who have been underestimated for far too long. Together, we can create a model that not only sustains but thrives, a legacy we can all be proud of." When she finished, the room erupted into applause. The deal was signed, sealing years of effort and dedication. Alia felt a wave of relief, but also a deep sense of responsibility. The work was only beginning. The ripple effect. That evening, Alia sat on the balcony of her hotel suite, overlooking the vibrant city lights. The deal had gone through smoothly, and the celebration dinner with her team had been filled with laughter and relief. Yet, as she sipped her tea, her thoughts returned to the morning's events. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message from Leonard. "Leonard, heard about the deal. Congratulations, you did it again. Also, just got an update from the aviation company. They're launching an internal review based on your report. Looks like Harris is under investigation. You're making waves, as always. Proud of you." Alia smiled faintly, setting the phone down. She wasn't one to revel in others' missteps, but she knew this was necessary. Change required accountability, and if Captain Harris's actions prompted the aviation company to reevaluate its practices, then something good had come from the confrontation. Her thoughts were interrupted by another buzz. This time, it was a message from Mira, the attendant from earlier. "Mira. Hi, Dr. Morgan. I just wanted to thank you again. After seeing how you stood your ground, I spoke to my supervisor about some things I've been experiencing at work. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. You gave me the courage to do that. Thank you for being such an inspiration." Alia felt a lump rise in her throat as she read the message. Moments like this reminded her why she fought so hard. It wasn't just about her success. It was about opening doors for others, about showing them what was possible. A call to action. The next morning, Alia stood in front of a packed auditorium, delivering the keynote address at the Global Summit on Sustainable Development. The audience was a mix of policymakers, activists, and business leaders, all eager to hear her insights. She began by sharing a story, not about the initiative, but about the confrontation with Captain Harris. "Yesterday on my way here, I was reminded of the obstacles we still face," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "I was reminded that no matter how much we achieve, there are still those who will question our place at the table. But let me be clear, I didn't let it stop me, and neither should you." Her words resonated, drawing nods and applause from the audience. She went on to outline the challenges ahead and the collective responsibility to create a fairer, more inclusive world, a future forged. As the summit concluded, Alia felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The work was far from over, but she had taken another step forward. Another battle fought, another ceiling cracked, and as she boarded her jet for the return flight, she carried with her the knowledge that she wasn't just flying home. She was soaring toward a future she had helped build. The sky stretched endlessly before her, a reminder of the possibilities that awaited those who dared to rise above. And Alia Morgan was more than ready to rise. She was ready to lead. A legacy sealed. As the jet ascended into the Nairobi night sky, the city lights twinkled below, fading into the distance. Dr. Alia Morgan sat in her seat, her body relaxed, but her mind alive with thoughts. The day had been a triumph, a culmination of years of hard work, but it was also a reminder of the battles yet to come. The Sustainable Harvest Initiative was now a reality, but she knew it was only the beginning. Implementation would be challenging, and the ripple effects of today's success would depend on the trust and collaboration she had worked so hard to cultivate. She leaned back in her seat, the cabin dimly lit and quiet. Outside, the stars glimmered against the inky blackness, a serene contrast to the bustling energy of Nairobi. Alia allowed herself a rare moment of stillness, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. A father's voice. In the quiet, her thoughts drifted to her father once again. James Morgan had always been her greatest inspiration and her fiercest supporter. Even in his later years, when age had slowed his body, but not his spirit, he had remained a constant source of wisdom. She could still hear his voice, steady and sure, reminding her of the importance of perseverance. "You don't fight battles just for yourself," he had said once, his hands clasped around a steaming mug of tea. "You fight them for the people who will walk through the doors you've opened." His words resonated now more than ever. Today had been one of those battles, a reminder that the fight for equality and respect was ongoing. But it was also a testament to the progress she had made, the lives she had touched, and the doors she had opened. The apology. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the cabin door. It opened slowly, and Captain Greg Harris stepped inside. His posture was less rigid than before, and his expression carried an air of humility. Alia raised an eyebrow, curious but cautious. "Dr. Morgan," Harris began, his voice low but steady. "I know I already apologized earlier, but I wanted to speak to you again. After some reflection, I realized that my behavior this morning wasn't just unprofessional, it was unacceptable. I made assumptions I had no right to make, and I failed to treat you with the respect you deserve. For that, I am truly sorry." Alia studied him for a moment, her sharp gaze unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured but firm. "Captain Harris, I appreciate your words. Acknowledging your actions is the first step toward change. But an apology isn't the end. It's the beginning. What matters is what you do next." Harris nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're right, and I intend to do better, not just as a pilot, but as a person. Thank you for calling me out. It's something I needed to hear." Alia nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Change is never easy, Captain, but it's necessary. I hope you'll follow through." As Harris left, Alia felt a glimmer of hope. People like him could change, if they chose to. And perhaps today's events had planted a seed that would grow into something better. A closing chapter. The rest of the flight was peaceful. Marcus checked in periodically, his demeanor more confident and assured than when the journey began. Alia offered him words of encouragement, knowing that even small gestures could have a profound impact. As the jet began its descent back home, Alia felt a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges she faced weren't just personal, they were systemic. But she was ready to confront them, just as she always had. Her work wasn't just about breaking barriers, it was about building bridges, about creating a world where no one had to justify their place at the table. The landing. When the jet touched down, Alia stepped out onto the tarmac, the cool night air brushing against her face. She glanced at the gleaming aircraft behind her, a symbol of her success and resilience. This journey had been one of triumph and confrontation, of progress and reflection, and as she walked toward the waiting car, she knew she was ready for whatever lay ahead. A message of gratitude. Later that night, as Alia settled into her home office, she opened her laptop to find an email from Mira. Subject: "Thank you. Dear Dr. Morgan, I just wanted to thank you again for your kindness and strength during today's flight. You probably don't realize the impact you had on me, but it was profound. Seeing you stand up for yourself and for others gave me the courage to speak up in my own life. I've already taken steps to address some issues at work, and I feel stronger because of it. Thank you for being a role model and a trailblazer. The world needs more people like you. With gratitude, Mira." Alia smiled, her chest swelling with quiet pride. Moments like this were the true reward, not the accolades or the titles, but the lives she touched along the way. She closed her laptop, her father's words echoing in her mind one final time. "You show them." And she would. Every day, in every space she entered, she would show them who she was. Not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her. With that thought, Alia leaned back, gazing out at the night sky. The stars were endless, a reminder of the limitless possibilities she was determined to pursue. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready.